I'm Christian Chiller. Welcome to my podcast, an enthusiastic ramble through whatever has taken my interest the past week or so. Expect technology, games, history, travel, geekery, and as always, much, much more. Welcome everybody, welcome to Chinchilla Squeaks with me, Christian Chiller. I am joining you this episode from an apartment covering Web Summit, the annual, very large gathering of tech and startups and tech industry and various other things in Lisbon, Portugal. So I am going to leave it quite short on the intro and outro this episode to bring you an interview I did with Richard a couple of months ago. We did reciprocal interviews, and he's already published the interview I did with him on his podcast. So there was finally time in my schedule to get his out, where we talk about developer relations. What is developer relations? What does it mean? What do the people who do it do? Are you in developer relations? Do you want to be in developer relations? What is it? What does it mean? What does all the terminology around it mean? And we dig in deep about that. He was great to speak to. I enjoyed our two conversations, and I hope you do too. Today I'm joined by Ricarhd Roger of VoxGig. Now, VoxGig has had a little bit of a history, hasn't it? I think I remember it being more of an events platform, and then various events of the past few years you had to change that a little bit. But maybe explain what is VoxGig and how you got to where you are now.
Hey, Chris. Great to be here. Thanks. Yes, I was a very good little startup boy, and I investigated my total addressable market. Because I was a conference speaker and I did developer relations in the old days, I went, conferences. That's a great, boring market. Nothing could ever happen to conferences. What could possibly go wrong? So got funding and built an event tech platform, mostly around the booth interactions, so in-person stuff.
Yeah.
Yes. So man plans and God laughs.
Things changed. Yeah. I feel like VoxGig had been around longer than sort of 2019, 2020, but I guess not. I guess that was when it was...
We actually started in 2017, mostly with an experimental search engine for tech conferences.
For CFPs and things.
Yeah, that sort of stuff.
Yeah.
So it was a little bit of a playing around just to see what was interesting. But of course, once you start doing pitch decks and actually taking funding, then you have to get very serious and focused and have a business model and all that sort of fun stuff.
Why did you want to do that in 2017? What was your journey so far that took you to that point?
For the first 10 years of my career, I was a back-end Java coder, which is possibly the most boring career you could imagine on earth. I never went to any meetups or conferences. I never participated in any communities or any of that sort of stuff. And I suppose towards the end of the noughties, I just started getting involved in communities. I had done a little bit of debate clubs and that sort of stuff in school, acting, drama, that sort of thing, and rediscovered a love of speaking on stage through that community and all that sort of stuff. And then ended up founding a software consultancy with a couple of other people, and I ended up being the main person who was shoved onto the stage to talk about microservices and Node.js and all that sort of fun stuff. I used to describe my job as being I was the performing monkey. But in doing that, I really developed a love for community and conferences and everything around that. And I didn't know at the time what it was called, but it turns out it was developer relations.
Developer relations made easy is literally what your website says. What is developer relations?
It is talking directly to developers, whether your product is something that developers use or whether developers are an important part of using your product. But it is making sure that the developers are seen, felt, and heard, because they're a crucial part of making your offering work. And in a way, there's kind of a correlation to another important constituency, investors, right? You often hear companies having investor relations. Developer relations, in the same way, are an important constituency. It's not a group of people that you sell to per se, but it's a group of people that you need to get on side. Now, if your product, for example, I don't know, offers monitoring or as feature flags or something like that, that is definitely a developer tool. You still can't sell directly to developers. Awfully difficult people. The more you try to sell to us, the less we believe you. In fact,
unless it's just like one-off developers or something.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, if a developer sees marketing material, traditional classic marketing material, they're like, well, this can't be any good. If it was good, they wouldn't have to market it. I would have heard about it on IRC or Discord or something, right? Exactly. Literally, right? So developer relations is about reaching those customers without traditional enterprise selling. But even if the people that you're selling to are a different constituency in the company, right? So where the product is developer enabled. So I don't know, it might be something like payments or authentication or something like that, where you are selling to the executives, but developers are going to implement it. Well, the developers could kill the deal because they don't like your API. So this is how Stripe became really successful, because if anybody, you have my sympathies, had tried to do payments integration before Stripe, it was awful. Right? Calculating your own hashes, all sorts of horrible stuff.
I did make some payment processors back in the day for Drupal with PayPal, which then was pretty hard to integrate because it was really one of the only options. And an Australian-specific payment provider called eWay, I think, which was equally just as bad, and probably no one's heard of outside of Australia.
I hear the pain in your voice, Chris. There's PTSD.
I think I still maintain the code officially, even though I've not touched it in years. So.
So Stripe came along and they just made it really easy, and the code was there, and you could just it could just work. So as a developer, I'm going to recommend Stripe because it pays attention to developer experience. So, I mean, in the early days, Stripe wasn't even doing developer relations as such.
Yeah.
But it effectively was, because it cared about developer experience.
Yeah.
So just to go back to your initial question, what is developer relations? It's caring about developer experience and understanding developers as an important constituency in whatever you're offering.
When does it have an origin, do you think? I mean, we hear about it a lot more recently, but I kind of get the impression it's probably one of those many things that's been around for longer than we think, especially for some maybe more traditional developer companies like, I don't know, Oracle or Sun or even IBM back in the day. When would you say developer relations, at least unofficially, started?
Okay, I do actually have a guess on that. So first of all, Oracle would be the classic counterexample. I don't know if you've ever suffered the...
Oh, for sure. No, just in terms of that they've been around for a while. That's all.
Have you ever suffered the withering embrace of Oracle salespeople? Developers just did not matter. If you've ever used, enterprise Java Beans or any of those things back in the day, right? Developer experience was not a thing they were thinking about. But I would say one of the first examples of what we would now call developer relations is the Kernighan and Ritchie book, C programming language.
Mm-hmm.
Because it was written to sell the great developer experience of the C programming language at the time compared to everything else. Mm-hmm. It's a short book. It's very carefully written. It has great code examples, all that sort of stuff. Now, I mean, it wasn't there was no intentionality there to be doing developer relations, but there was a care and an empathy for developers that you didn't see in other systems. And then, and I suppose the first sorts of developer relations would have been done by people who are inventing languages and trying to evangelize for them. The Camel book by Larry Wohl, right, the Perl programming language, is another example in the same vein, right? Much longer book, but full of the same sort of really succinct code examples with a sprinkling of heavily ironic text in it. Always a joy to read. And then I think another great example would be an early blogger called Tim Bray, who did a lot of evangelizing for XML when it was first coming out. And then later I don't think it really took off as much, but I don't know if you remember the early days of blogging, there was a lot of fights over the RSS standard, who had actually invented it and which one to use.
Yep, I do remember.
So Tim Bray, again, did a lot of evangelizing for Atom, which was meant to be the sort of all-embracing standard, except that it was like, so you have 3 standards, invent a new one. Oh, now you have another problem.
The usual.
Now you've got 4. So that's an example of it being done
Mm.
unconsciously. But the exact same skill sets, the exact same types of things, generating content, having examples, talking about it, embracing the community, even if the community was just comments on your blog. We are now conscious about
Mm.
it. We now recognize it. The state of the art is here's a list of attributes and activities and things that you have to do, write code, community, and content. It has been structured a bit more, but those are the
Yeah.
substance is still the same.
Yeah. And there's actually some people use different names: developer evangelism, developer advocacy, sometimes even maybe, although less so, like community management. That's something a bit different. But do you think they're all those developer something jobs are kind of the same, or the choices of words mean that maybe a company or a person has a different approach, or is it just terminology?
So it's there's there's kind of a scale where on one end like there's
Mm.
real differences, right? The sky is blue and grass is green, and then at the other side, if you're a fan of Jonathan Swift, do you open your eggs on the little
Yeah.
end or the big end, right? And the differences are mostly towards the little end, big end side of ridiculousness. I think there are some historical legacies. So Microsoft especially would have been, if you think about evangelism and developer evangelism, what
Yeah.
Microsoft has been doing for years is more
Yeah.
classically
Yeah.
evangelizing. Whereas people who go to conferences and deliberately don't pitch their product, but they talk about an
Yeah,
interesting
yeah, yeah, yeah,
application
yeah.
of it, or they just talk about insights and stuff they've learned, but it's very soft.
Yeah,
That's more
I get you.
what you regard as advocacy, but they're
Yeah.
all in the same
So
conceptual space.
actually, there is a subtle difference in the roles depending on the title. In that,
Yeah.
evangelism is maybe a bit more, "Hey, look at me," bit more marketing placed. Maybe relations is sort of community support, marketing, pre-sales, etc., etc. And advocacy, I don't know. I think it's probably pretty similar to relations, but or maybe sometimes you could say an advocate is more internal, even.
Oh, this absolutely. So there's internal developer relations, absolutely, and then developer relations people who work with partners. So there's a whole there's sort of an entire Linnaean hierarchy of subgenres within the role. It's a space for everybody. I mean, you have people who are doing developer relations who are community managers first and foremost. They don't really write
Yeah.
that much code. Now,
Yeah.
I think that's just as much of a legitimate activity as anything else. I don't think you
Yeah.
per se have to write code.
Well, let's actually get into that. So you've mentioned a few as we go, but what do you think typically would be the kind of work that a developer relations person might do, depending on the company and the product, et cetera, et cetera? But
Okay, so I'll break it down into two types of companies, right? Developer first, which is where you're selling a developer tool.
Yep.
In that scenario, you've got to reach developers directly. So you definitely have to be someone who can write code, and you definitely have to be. This is sort of the high elf, maybe to put it in D&D terms, developer advocate role, right? Where you are speaking at meetups and conferences,
Yeah.
you are writing code, you're writing technical blog posts, you're going on podcasts talking about it, maybe you're hosting your own one. It's pretty deep stuff. You don't tend to be running a community or doing anything like that, right? You're within the communities, but you may not have very well developed
Okay.
community management skills, moderatorship skills, that type of thing, which is a different type of thing. But you may have people supporting you who do that. But the developer advocates at those type of companies tend to be much more like developers and probably were developers to begin with. And then you have developer enabled companies where the ultimate decision maker is not a developer. They're further up the chain. But the developers are going to make a critical input. They're critical influencers. They can kill the deal. So if those developers have been nurtured as part of a community where they see that the company has supported their favorite open source, is turning up to conferences, has credibility. I interviewed a guest that the podcast hasn't come out yet, but recent guest that I interviewed spoke about one of the measures that they use, which is that they ask how many developers in the sales prospect have already heard of them. Right. So that is asking how effective has their developer relations activities been at developing community feeling, developing a good feeling towards the company, that type of thing. So in that role, it's less important to be generating, massive code samples or to being seen to be a, credible former open source contributor, that type of thing. But there's a massive amount of crossover, right? I know people who can do all those skills and more. I know people who don't really code, but they're just amazing at building communities. The type of person that will walk into a room and they know who everybody is within 30 minutes. People like that, they're magical. I can't even explain how they do it.
Is there a time when it's the right time for a company to hire someone for developer relations? I've certainly seen some companies who seem to hire very early, some who hire maybe too late, some who hire when they don't even really know what that person should do. When do you think is the right time to say, we've got to this point, we need someone to do these sorts of things because of X, Y, Z?
I think it fits into the kind of standard conundrum that you have as a growing company, where initially the CEO or the founding team literally does everything, and then you have to carve out bits as you go. Certainly in the early days, you have to be credible, so it has to be the founders. So one of my other guests a little while back is a great company called Checkly HQ. They do kind of online monitoring, right? Online sort of validation, synthetic testing, I think they call it. Where it was originally like a solo founder, and the founder was doing the developer relations to begin with. And now that has moved to a scenario where they have a team and all that sort of stuff. And I believe that happened post-funding, right? Because that's what lets you hire that team. But clearly there was a point where one person just couldn't do it anymore. But I see other companies. So one of them founded by a very good former colleague of mine, Platformatic, Matteo Collina, is one of the founders there, and I don't think he's ever going to stop doing developer relations because it's in his blood, right? He participates very heavily in open source, and it's part of their value that the founders will never hand that over to somebody else. There might be a team, but they will be the people doing it for a long time.
Yeah. On the sort of other side of that, not just a timing thing, do you think there are companies that shouldn't hire? Sometimes I sort of see people looking for developer relations, and I look at the product or the company and kind of think, will developers actually like this product? I don't know, maybe that's why they need someone, but I've definitely encountered people who work in dev roles for companies where they don't really understand what they should be doing. I actually have a friend here who works for a pretty well-known local large company. He's supposed to be doing developer relations for a particular aspect of their product, and a couple of years later, and is finding himself still doing nothing because they don't really understand what they should be doing as a company.
Yeah.
I don't know. Are there certain, what would you say a company has to be willing to do or not do, or to give up control of, et cetera, to say that a developer relations person could be successful and not just kind of a ticked box that the company thinks they should have?
Yeah, you kind of need to have an appreciation for what developer relations, the value that it can bring to an organization from the most senior leadership.
Yep.
So it is not just a subset of marketing, and you can't measure it just by click-throughs or whatever, right? Because that's going to annoy people. But it's also not a technical role. It's not really customer success or customer support, where developer relations is under the CTO and they're fixing things. That's not what it is either, right? So if you have a kind of a misunderstanding about how it builds value, you end up structuring it incorrectly or assigning people to do stuff and giving it a title that doesn't actually match what it is. And we kind of just have to go back to the value that it brings, which is that you are signaling that as an organization, you are technically safe to deal with.
Mm.
Because I, as a developer, if I recommend the product or if I sign off on it, I'm the one left holding the baby rabbit when things go wrong, right? And I'm the one that gets shouted at when the site goes down, and I can't really turn around and say, "Oh, well, this third-party provider is broken." Maybe I can once or twice, but if that happens, if that happens repeatedly, then I'm the one who made the mistake. Yeah. I'm the one who has to expend political capital making the choice. So developer relations makes me feel safe. And measuring that is hard because it's not the number of articles that I've read, and it's not the fact that I've closed a sales deal. I mean, one example I use of my own experience selling via developer relations is we ended up closing a deal with a very large consultancy, world famous, because one of their technical people came to a small conference talk that I did. And that deal didn't close until 2 years later.
Yeah.
But because of because of what we were doing and the stuff we were talking about, it was clear that we were a safe pair of hands. If you think about it from a sales enablement perspective, right, you're trying to remove any technical objections.
Yeah. I think actually you started leading there nicely into kind of another point and into what VoxGig is and does and why these days. Measuring something like developer relations has always been notoriously hard, and which is why we tend to find in times like we're experiencing now, where there's a bit of a downturn and people want to cut budgets, they tend to be some of the first roles to go because it's very hard to prove what they do. As you say, there's certain things you can track, but they don't say everything. I certainly remember this in the past where I would do talks and things and it would equal a client, but who knows when, and just because you provided them a referral link to follow doesn't mean they followed it, and et cetera, et cetera. So there was always so many ways that it was completely unmeasurable, but you could always have this sort of feeling that it was useful, So I think that kind of brings us to maybe what you and a few others seem to be doing now, which is a growing amount of developer relations as a service, as a consultant, et cetera, et cetera. Do you think that's one of the main reasons, the economy, or are there other reasons, like in terms of when companies scale and things like that, and they want to have someone, but they can't really afford a full-time person yet? What are some of the reasons you think there's been more and more, and we're talking about some people who are very well known in this space who are now doing consultancy instead of working for somebody, and there can be varying reasons someone would want to be a consultant as opposed to on staff, but what do you think some of the reasons for seeing an increasing amount of developer relations contractors is recently?
So it is a specific skill set, right? You can't just anoint a given senior engineer or an architect level person and say, "Oh, go speak at conferences." Now, ironically, that's how a lot of us got our start. We were randomly chosen by our bosses to go to this conference, sink or swim. There is a specific set of skills. There's a specific set of understanding, maybe even arrogance, right? Because you have to be willing to write down technical opinions.
I think arrogance is the right way. It's confidence, that's for sure. Which can sometimes become arrogance. There are definitely some developer relations people who've been doing it for a long time and do get a little overly confident, should I say?
Yeah, well, that's part of the deal. I think it's unfair to say that you could just force somebody into the role, or take somebody who's a very, very capable engineer and say you have to go do this other thing now that involves spending 80% of your time not coding. So it is a specific skill and it has to be learned, and it's one of those skills where we haven't really figured everything out yet. So you can only learn by doing, by apprenticeship. The entire lore of it is all based on war stories and stuff that worked and anecdata. I suppose there's 5 years of it now being kind of a credible role, but there's another 5 years until we figure out best practices, really.
Is that only 5 years? Really? That is, I feel like it.
Well, people have been doing it for a lot longer, but it's only about 5 years where you have seen developer relations roles started to be offered.
I would probably argue a little longer, but okay. It's reasonable. It's not far off. Yeah.
it's fuzzy at the edges, of
Yeah.
course. I mean, you could look at companies like MongoDB, right, that have been doing it for a very long time and have been calling it that for a very long time. But I'm speaking more in terms of, okay, we've done our Series A now. What's missing? Oh, we're not doing developer relations. We need to hire the dev advocate, right? Actually, yeah, it's the point in time at which it comes on to the radar and vocabulary of the venture as one of those essential things that you need to be doing. So I think unless you have a company where the founder has an intuitive feel for it. So, for example, the ones that I mentioned, right, Checkly HQ and Platformatic, the founder has it in their heart, and they know how to make it happen within that organization and can hire for it by feel. If you don't have that, if you're a non-technical founder, but it's a developer-enabled business, lots of those out there. If it's vertical SaaS, that sort of thing, but you have to have an API and SDKs and integrations and a partner program and all that sort of stuff. That's where the consultancy side of things can help, because companies like ourselves can bring that to the table in terms of putting it all together and making sure that the developer relations activity within that company is done to the best of our limited understanding of how it should be done anyway.
So you're not, it's strategy about companies who want to move into it but don't know how, but also some of the implementation detail around that.
Oh yeah, I mean it's actually a thing. So I would say half of our clients are vertical SaaS, which means that they may have got an external agency to build their system. They may have only just started hiring. Maybe they just closed the Series A and they've just hired a CTO, and that person is just filling out the team. But now they need to build an SDK and then support a small community of partner integrations. Should they be defining Swagger docs, or should it be open API? We end up having conversations where we're trying to explain why your SDK needs to be open source, and the client may not even understand the importance of something like that, in terms of building trust, right? And meetups, like, which ones are you going to sponsor? Meetups are so cheap to sponsor, it's ridiculous. 50 quid a pop, and you can build credibility in so many different audiences, but which ones? Right. So just understanding all of those basic things that, if you've been involved in open source and communities for a long time, just seem so obvious. But they don't fit into traditional sales activity. Yeah. So someone who's founded a vertical SaaS because they have domain experience in an industry of some kind doesn't really understand the way that they need to corral developers into taking them.
With regards for developer relations for the future, assuming and hoping that we continue sort of through this rocky period, and anyone who's been around for a while knows it's not the first, so it won't be the last, but a few other things definitely changed the scope of developer relations over the past few years. The classic person in an airport coding on a laptop, one event after another, all the war stories in the after party and all this kind of stuff. For a little while that was on pause, and it's back somewhat, but it isn't completely back for various reasons. Economy, costs of things, there's been some shake-up to a lot of the conference ecosystem. Not all events are as successful as they were in the past, et cetera, et cetera. There's a lot of factors that have changed things not quite back to how they were. So what do you think will be the future model of developer relations moving forward that will be most successful? I mean, there's obviously various ways, but what do you think is going to be the most successful way forward from now?
Yeah, so let me preface that by saying there's definitely a short-term blip, mostly caused by the fact that the whole funding scene is shut down a lot this year. So budgets just aren't there, and savings are being sought, and marketing teams and everybody in marketing teams often suffers as a result. But if you think about the overall trends, I'll go back to vertical SaaS, right? In the past, you could set up a website with a user interface and provide some sort of services, I don't know, for managing hairdressers, right? That type of stuff, and have quite a successful SaaS business. But now we're entering into a period where you've got to be able to integrate. people expect an integration. They're going like, where's your Zapier integration?
Yep.
Right. And various things like ChatGPT need to be able to talk to you because people just expect it. So who's going to build that? Who's going to generate a community? Who's going to make sure that the developers and the no-code developers who are trying to talk to your system are looked after? So I don't think there's anything. I don't think that trend just seems inevitable. Right? The way that customers will interface with your company is going to, of course, there are going to be people clicking on websites, but there are a whole groups of super fans who want to integrate and interact in much more interesting ways. And a lot of that is technical, and a lot of that is developer focused, and a lot of that involves developer tooling. So, I mean, some of the vertical SaaS clients that we've been brought into had offered industry tools, but then it turns out that there's an internal developer team in a client that wants to integrate. So they never thought they'd need an API. Didn't seem like that wasn't on the plan. But now, to make the sale, oh right, we need an API. So the overall trend is towards having developers external to your organization interfacing with you. So whether that is something that happens after the sale or before it or part of it or is part of what's been seen as developer relations up to now doesn't really matter, because there has to be an activity in the organization to support that, to make it happen. So I wouldn't read too much into the fact that fashionable VC funded startups can't get their Series A or Series B and have to make some budget cuts. I don't think that's saying a lot about developer relations per se.
Yeah, fair enough. Yeah,
I think that's just more saying interest rates have gone up.
Yeah. So do you think the way they will do it will change? I mean, I think there's just constantly going around conferences is probably not the only way these days. We've talked about podcasts, and obviously for a period of time there was live streams and things like that. I also do worry with conferences. You have a captive audience. We always knew it was a very inefficient way of getting an audience. The costs and the time undertaking versus the response was generally quite low ratio, but it was fun for one, and those people who were listening to your talk were kind of listening to your talk. Whereas I think a lot of people found especially during sort of 2020 to 2023, it may have changed a bit now. There was so much people got so sick of watching things online that a lot of live streams, Twitches and Discord servers and things are all feeling a bit dead now. So it's kind of interesting to see what happens. Will there be some communities that really continue to focus around that online only? Some other communities that go back to the way it always was, or probably what is more realistic, it'll be hybrid. It'll depend, as always, in technology. But do you think there's anything that is completely done now? We're not doing that anymore for whatever reason.
No.
Okay.
So after taking the mick out of after taking the mick out of VCs, I'm now going to quote one, right? So there's this great book, if you're doing startups, called The Hard Thing About Hard Things, written by this guy called Ben Horowitz. And he has this anecdote in it about some piece of software they were writing was really slow, and they were looking for all these magic solutions. It was really slow, and it was really bad compared to competitors. But he kind of came up with this mantra of no silver bullets, right? Because there is no silver bullet. There's no way to avoid the hard graft of doing all the things that you have to do.
Oh, I thought you were going to tell me that there was, but okay, all right, sorry.
Yeah, well, it would be great if there was, right? Play the lottery. I think that's although most lottery winners lose all their money after 3 years or 5 years or something. There's a lot of different channels and a lot of different ways to interact with people, and there are new ones, and none of them are going to go away. And you're going to have to do all of them, and you're going to have to figure out where to prioritize and have a story around all the ones that you're doing. And some you just won't have capacity to do some, and you'll have to do others. And there is no simple prophecy that, okay, right, well, it's all going back to conferences. That's it, back to the way it was. or everything is going to be hybrid now, so that's it. I mean, a lot of hybrid events really suffer because they're the worst of both worlds. You're almost better off just either having a fully virtual event or fully in person and videos afterwards.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, look what happened to Hopin, right? I got so much flack over that
They're
at the
still
time,
going, aren't they?
when COVID happened, because so many people were going, but you could just turn it to Hopin. You just copy Hopin's business model and get loads more funding.
I see what you mean. Yeah, and we were already
because we
were already seeing that a lot of businesses that kind of thought that would be the way it always was are now failing. Even companies like Zoom are not doing as well because the memberships haven't sustained or something like that. I don't know. There's a whole bunch of, I think there was a little bit of short-sightedness and naivety about thinking this is it, this is the new normal. It's like, and now we'll see what the new normal is from now on. I think we'll probably find that developer relations has to be a lot more, especially for the next year or so, a lot more. We've already said that metrics are hard to do, but they will be expected to justify themselves a lot more somehow and justify everything, you know. You want to go to that event in Australia? Are you sure?
Yeah. Well, that's, you know, sometimes it's handy if you want to visit Australia. It's a good bet. I think there's an underlying trend here which people should be aware of, which is the era of universal platforms is kind of coming to an end.
Mm-hmm.
Right, so, you know, MySpace, Facebook, and Twitter, and places like that, where everybody was on the one place. So it kind of sets up a mental model where you're thinking about, okay, what's the thing that I need to be on, the critical thing that I need to be on, where everything's going to happen. There's a significant balkanization happening at the moment, right? To use an old word.
It's actually interesting you mentioned that. That is something that I think definitely a lot of people who grew up in developer relations in the past few years, they were used to using Twitter and a couple of other platforms, and now it's like, where do we go? Everything is in different places. There was actually a Substack post I read this week around, am I just getting old or are all the social platforms bad? You know, and there's a little bit of both. The kind of broadcast, hello, I'm Chris. Listen to me. Twitter has kind of gone. And what has replaced it?
The other thing that's
still trying to figure out, especially as older folks are still trying to figure out.
The other thing that's happening is, back in the day when we were doing DevRel, there weren't very many of us.
Yeah.
So it was kind of easy, right? If you wrote, I mean, I have written articles that have got onto the front page of Hacker News up to slot number 1. Right, that could be done back in the day. Good luck doing that now, right?
I know, and if you even try and push it, it's like, go away.
Go away. But there's just a lot more developer relations activity going on, right? So that just means that the standard has gone up, and you know, standing out is not really possible. I think it's more just about doing it well.
Well, so on that, just as a sort of final 2 questions for those of people who are listening here and think, that sounds something interesting. It would be something I'd be interested in moving into from wherever you are. What would you recommend as the first few steps to try and transition into the kind of role?
Do meetup talks.
Good one.
Meetups are fabulous because it's really low stress. You usually get lots of support. You know, you turn up to your local meetup. Often there's only 10 or 20 people. Sometimes they do like lightning talk rounds. It's much less stressful in terms of public speaking than going to a conference or trying to get a CFP accepted or something like that. You don't have to start speaking straight away. Just start participating more, so that you can kind of pick up the vibe a little bit. There's a certain, I mean, you might find public speaking difficult, but at a certain point, there is a necessity to get some sort of a kick out of it. Even if you're really stressed and you get a bit of an adrenaline boost at the end or whatever. Because that is an essential part of the job.
Exactly.
And I think that's a good way to test yourself to see, is this something for me or not?
There's a whole bunch of discussion around how to do that. I think you've had I had something I wrote ages ago that I actually need to redo. You know, there's a whole bunch of ways to prepare yourself, and actually it's like a lot of performance things. For most people, once you've done it a couple of times, it gets easier and more enjoyable, et cetera, et cetera.
It's a skill like any other, right? It's not, people aren't born magical public speakers.
Well, some, but
you know, I mean, you have to mess up. I mean, I don't live code anymore because I've realized that's really hard,
tough
right?
fun.
I remember trying to do it one time and messing up my keystrokes or whatever, and it was a very small meetup space, and I could hear the people in the front row going, oh my god, he's dying." So,
there have been some. I think my best time was when I left some database details up on screen, and whilst I was talking, someone connected the database together. But that's actually kind of fun. It's kind of enjoyable in some respects.
Yeah. Pro tip: if you're doing virtual events, shut down every application.
Yes.
Before you start, then only open the ones you want.
Yeah, there's a whole bunch of these things. Yeah, I think you're right.
Right. So there's sort of micro tips like that. I mean, I think you have to enjoy writing as well.
Or creating content.
Not code, but like text.
Yeah.
Because that's a critical role. I mean, even if there are developers who don't do public speaking, but they generate a lot of content.
Yeah.
So I think that's something you just have to have an affinity towards. You don't have to be good. I mean, throw it in ChatGPT and say, please improve the quality of this text.
Let's not go there. That's a big topic. Okay, so to wrap up, what's the future for VoxGig? What are you planning in the next 6 months or so?
We are a developer relations agency and full service, which means that we're going to continue to expand the range of services that we offer to people who are trying to get developer relations off the ground, but also starting to build tools around those activities. So we run our own podcast. So do you, right? I don't know about you, but it's an awful lot of grunt work running a podcast. There's all sorts of things that need a lot of automation. And it's not, I mean, of course you can pay a lot of money for HubSpot and you've got all your marketing automation, content calendars or whatever. But, we feel there's not enough tooling around specific activities. So we're literally building the tools to help ourselves, right? We look at all of our spreadsheets and go, the day we can delete this spreadsheet is going to be a good day. So I think watch the space because we'll hopefully release some interesting things, little tools. It's not the core business, but I think people will find them useful.
And that was my interview with Ricarhd. As I said, I won't take too much of your time on the other side of the interview. My first request, as I have been the past few episodes, is if you enjoyed the show, if you've been on the show, if you listened to the show, if you just dropping in for the first time, or if you're a repeat listener, please leave me a review. Please share an episode. Please leave a review wherever you happen to listen to podcasts. Not too much from me at this point because everything is just squashed between travel at the moment. I am currently at Web Summit. I think by the time this episode is out, I'll mostly be gone. I'll also be at Slush in Helsinki in a couple of weeks. If you want to meet there, let me know. Loads and loads of interviews I am still editing, getting in progress. What else has been happening? I have about 3 videos in progress, about 2 blog posts in progress, but none of them are quite finished. I've been working very heavily on a couple of books as well. So lots of things in progress, as always. And actually recorded and basically ready to go is the first episode of a new podcast, which is going to be quite different. Nothing tech related at all. That'll probably release in the new year. And also doing some pre-planning for another new podcast that will launch in the new year as well. More of all those to follow very soon. But for now, I will say thank you very much for joining me. You can find more about me at christianchiller.com. And take care, everybody. I hope you enjoyed the show. Find out more about me at christianchiller.com, where you can find show notes, sign up for my newsletter, and find all of my writing, games, work, and video links. There's also details on how to get in touch with me. And if you want to get even closer to what I do, join my Discord server for behind-the-scenes discussions and helping me